Thank you, Elena, for joining us today on the We Need to Act podcast. It is a great honor to have such an inspiring woman with us. And I wanted to start by asking you about your work. Your work began decades ago with a profound experience in Ladakh, a region that was largely untouched by the global economy at the time. And what you witnessed there deeply changed your perception of Western civilization and modern ideas of progress. What was it about Ladakh that inspired you to question the industrial growth model and ultimately launched the localization movement through your work and also your book, Ancient Futures?
Well, I think it's essentially that this was an area that had been protected from the impact both of Christian missionaries and of the colonial global trading economy. And so people have been able to develop their own systems, were more in control, and they had been establishing themselves in a very difficult environment. It's a desert up at 12,000 feet, and it's very careful adaptation to scarcity, which led to keeping population stable. And I think it was also related to giving women and women's work high status. So it was a remarkable, finely tuned, well balanced culture that had both avoided the impact of Christian missionary and later on, because it's a part of Tibet that belongs to India, it was sealed off from the modern world. So no one had been allowed to go there. So the impact of the media, tourism, and all that had not affected people. And when I arrived as one of the first outsiders, I was a linguist, I learned to speak the language fluently, fairly quickly. And that, I think, is what gave me an insight into how and why people were so much happier. And that in turn translated into also more peaceful, more tolerant than anything I had experienced. And I had grown up in Sweden, and Sweden was seen as quite a good example of a relatively balanced industrial society that I realized from having spent a few years in Ladakh, because I went out originally to help make a film over 6 weeks. But I fell in love with the people. I stayed on to study the language more. And after I lived there for 2 years, I experienced that this way of life had allowed people to maintain their close human connections, so between old and young, and a deep sense of community with a few hundred people. And that was needed in order to live off the land very easily, with very little work. They worked many fewer hours a day than we do, and yet they were so well off and above all so happy. So when I went back to Sweden, I suddenly realized why we had, even though we were so successful as an industrial culture, there was a lot of depression and even suicide, alcoholism, suicide. So that really opened my eyes to understanding the impact of the economy.
Yes, you were right. And it's something that is increasing,
Yeah,
unfortunately. All
yeah.
depression, loneliness, as you mentioned, everything has to do with globalization and these big corporations that have been gaining power. And I came from the corporate world, actually.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I did. And you said that these big corporations are often overshadowing governments, driving war, finance, and technological control, as we see in many governments right now. And in a world where profit tends to override people and the planet, how can empowering local communities and grassroots movements genuinely counteract this trend and begin to reclaim democratic power, which we are losing right now?
Yeah, well, it's a very big ask, and it's I think very important to distinguish between the importance of starting to rebuild deeper community
Mhm.
structure. And that means local economies, particularly around the central issue of food, but
Mhm.
also mother care, even how we give birth, how we die. In so many ways of life now, we don't realize, but a very commercial, inhuman, cruel system has made all of those things pretty unpleasant and unnatural. But I'm so happy to have seen from the ancient indigenous culture that the more natural, the more community based way of doing things worked so much better. And so, whether it was more natural births, whether it was smaller farms with more diversified food, with more people working on the land together, whether it was actually also making things out of natural fibers for clothing, natural building material, it turned out that if we have enough labor, which all indigenous people did, all that work becomes easy. But it's when we've been pushed away from the land and the resources, and through schooling, we've been robbed of the skills. So then suddenly it seems impossible to survive without being dependent on these big industries and big technology. However, what has made me very motivated and very acting is that I've helped to strengthen and to start more localized projects. And partly that's meant also supporting more traditional people to maintain their skills, not to feel inferior and backward, because that's what the dominant narrative tells people. So
Mhm.
partly we've worked with people in the so-called poor countries to maintain respect for their skills, for their more natural, their more community-based ways of doing things. And in the West, we've helped to establish both eco-villages, local food systems, local financing. When we do that, we're actually starting to create the foundations of a healthier economy. And on a small scale, there is a lot that's being done that's very meaningful. However, right now, governments, without any exception that I know of, they're all signing off on allowing global banks and corporations to run their country. They have removed all rules for these corporations. They've even signed agreements that they won't do anything to limit their profit. And if
Mhm.
they do, our governments can be taken to court. I am convinced that if most thoughtful citizens, particularly people who are giving part of their life to do something about climate or to try to reduce poverty, that if they could only have more information, and I really do think we learn from information, from relevant information presented as part of understanding the system that's dominating us. So more holistic, more systemic information and understanding right now is vital. I believe that within another few years, these things I'm saying will become more obvious because the way that governments have signed away their power, which now includes allowing global banks and businesses to not only make use of algorithms, but AI. And those tools in the hands of giant industries are extremely destructive. They cannot deal with the specific situation in particular places, particular cultures, particular individuals. So we're already suffering from this. I mean, but people haven't quite woken up yet to understand why and how this operates. It's fine for us to use AI, to use algorithms if they're available to us, and to use this medium of the internet and social media to get a different picture out. So when these tools are used to strengthen the wealth creation by global giants, it's going to be having worse and worse impact among many other things. It will widen the gap between rich and poor even more. In every country, anyone who can, open their eyes will see how crazy this
True.
gap is. And we need more discussion of why. Where is this coming from? Why? And that's what we're providing in Local Futures, my
True.
organization network that I'm part of. And I hope that people will help to spread the word and to do that in a non-aggressive way. I've worked with a lot of small farmers and small business people, try to help strengthen them, starting farmers markets and that kind of thing. I've also been in discussion with political leaders and CEOs, and it's really not that the people at the top are more greedy. Greedy people, you can find also among small businesses that are very threatened and that are often committing suicide because they're struggling to stay alive. So it's not about greed. It's about the fact that almost no one is talking about how this system works. Almost no one is talking why we're not only widening the gap between rich and poor, but we are, as a collective, allowing businesses to use more and more resources, more and more scarce minerals, more and more water in order to replace people. This is madness on a crowded, polluted planet. We need to be doing exactly the opposite. We should be encouraging, incentivizing all businesses to employ more people and use less energy, less technology, fewer minerals, less of the earth. This is a formula, employing more people, using less of the earth's resources, a formula that could heal people and the planet very rapidly. But we need to get a discussion of this out. And we need to find people who are brave enough to talk about this and who realize that they can do so with compassion without blaming any particular government or any particular corporations. Everybody's focused on Trump as a boogeyman. Trump has out of his system where people are more and more dissatisfied with government. And classically, they then vote for smaller government, but that actually means opening up the rape and pillage of your own local resources, your own labor force by giant global corporations.
True. And you pointed out, very interesting things. And it reminded me of a recent conversation I had with Tyson Yunkaporta. Do you know him? He's an Aboriginal from Australia. And he suggested that money and wealth themselves aren't a problem. The problem is when they are used to control and coerce people. And often said that we are victims of global economic systems that enlarge big corporations. Do you believe it's still possible to awaken people from this illusion, as you said? He said that we are living in an illusion, and how can we help them reconnect with
Yeah,
more
does he
meaningful?
say it was impossible to awaken them?
No, he didn't say that. We talked about different things, including also what you mentioned, AI, and the new
Yeah.
type of relationships that are being built with AI, between humans, AI, and we need to think about that as well. And it was a
Yeah,
really interesting conversation.
I know Tyson personally, and I'm very fond of him. I think he is maybe more pessimistic than I am. I do think it's possible.
Probably.
I do think it's possible, but I think too few people are focused on the work of sharing that big picture. So I call that big picture activism. Too few people realize just how enormous the propaganda has been to get us believing that more technology is necessary, that global trade is beneficial, that progress is this and that, when actually we've been taken backward. And I think the activism of sharing the big picture, which I'm glad you're doing a podcast, and I think podcasts, doing anything we can to share that bigger picture is the most important activism right now. Many people want to focus on starting a particular project, helping a particular group or a particular indigenous tribe or, whatever it might be. I worry that not enough money and not enough energy and effort is going into articulating and spreading the big picture so that people are informed, so that they know that they have a choice. The choice is now to vote left or right. The choice is, do we come together as citizens, as civic society, to insist on different policies? It will be a new politics. It's not the conventional party politics. It will be the people's movements that demand a shift away from corporate rule, basically, to some kind of democracy.
True. But I feel that many people are alienated. There is this growing alienation regarding a lack of hope, perhaps, that they can't
Yeah,
do anything because they see governments not doing, losing power to big corporations. They don't see them
yeah,
doing the right thing, and people are losing hope. They say, like, I don't do anything about that because I know I can't make a
yeah,
difference.
yeah. No, I think that's absolutely true. That right now, people have, whenever they think politics, they've been thinking the party politics that have been available in their country. And so they're thinking either about a type of activism, which is almost always more narrow, it's more narrowly focused. Like right now, on a particular issue, on a particular, but every kind of issue, people's rights, the poverty, climate, but not looking holistically at how for all people and for all life on earth, we must change an economic system that literally, as we speak, is extinguishing species. And it's doing that also by extinguishing languages, cultures, and very few organizations talk about this. And and it can maybe mean because they feel, oh, it's too big, we can't do anything about it. But I think that's precisely why we're not focusing where we need to focus. And it is also, it's been called the invisible hand of the economy. We've been so brainwashed into believing that if I'm going to talk about the economy, I have to be an economist. So
Yeah.
this is our message is whatever you do, don't study economics. We want you to be willing as a sensible, caring, intelligent human being to simply look at the facts about this economy. Look at the truth of how progress is measured. GDP goes up with illness. It goes up with breakdown. Literally, the water being so polluted you have to buy it in bottle is good for GDP. And we're allowing our governments to use that measure. It
True.
seems, once you really step back to look at it, it's so crazy. How could any environmentalist think it's worth battling on particular environmental issues if the very measure of progress is going to increase with more pollution and more breakdown? So it is such a fundamental issue, the economy. It's not just this side issue, some numbers, and you have to be an economist to understand it. Precisely as an economist, you've been trained to ignore the entire environment. You have no ecological literacy whatsoever. You have been trained not to understand human psychology. You've been into mouth the words that this is happening because of innate human greed. So the economy is actually now a man-made system. It's like a machine that's using algorithms, now also using AI, and this is going to speed up and get worse in order to figure out how to extract more wealth to global corporations. It's nothing to do with what's happening in your country, or Portugal, or my country, of Sweden, or in Ladakh. It's to do with this global empire. So it takes a little while for people to maybe to think about this. I hope if they're listening to me, they'll be willing to look at our website, localfutures.org, and look at our films, which try to spell out this bigger picture. Because the most important thing is to spread the word. I cannot imagine that people who are giving of their time and their money as volunteering or donating to environmental or social causes, that they're going to keep ignoring the economy. It just cannot last much longer. At the moment, that is what's happening, that there's far too little focus on the economy from the point of view of people who love nature, who want a more just and egalitarian system. I guess there's one other part of this where I feel very empowered, and that is that the baseline in Ladakh showed me that we do not need to have either a socialist or a communist government that insists on leveling everything so that everybody has exactly the same amount. That's not necessary. If we remove the rights of the monopolies dominate, then there will be some businesses that are a bit bigger. There'll be some that are a bit smaller. There'll be some that earn a bit more money. There'll be some people who work harder will have a bit more money. But it will be within the visible frame of democratic decision making. We can no longer continue pretending we have a democracy if we allow these life important issues to happen in closed boardrooms, in global forums where the average citizen has no say whatsoever.
That's true. That's so true. And this is something really simple to understand, that we cannot have endless growth in a finite planet. This is very simple. How can we continue? But it's I think we have grown so apart from nature, and there was a recent study saying that in the past 200 years we lost 60% of our connection with nature, which is huge. And if we don't have that connection with nature, it's really hard for us to understand that when I mean nature, I also mean living in communities, because the rise of urban cities, and we need communities to continue to feel part of something.
But I also want to tell you, I've ended up working in many, many different countries. Our films and books have been translated into about 50 languages, between them. And yet, very hard in the last 30 years or so to get into the mainstream media, but we're still getting out somehow, amazingly.
It's control.
And what I also want to tell you that, anywhere I go, and I really believe that everywhere in the world, this is true. And that is, if you say to people that our governments are subsidizing and removing any regulations for global business, in the meanwhile, that's destroying our local farmers, our local businesses, our local economies. We believe we have to change that. What do you think? From Russia to Sweden to Ladakh to America, I have found everywhere people agree. So once you understand that this is very much about the global out of sight businesses versus local businesses, local farmers, and you start framing it that way, and you start seeing how many examples there are of local food economies where people have shortened the distances, set up farmers markets, farmer shops, And they're seeing land that had been breeding monocultures, because that's what our governments were pressuring because of the corporate profit taking. They were pushing for big monocultures that inevitably have to use a lot of chemicals that then produce health issues, destroy the land. And all of this is subsidized. And so now, without any help, it's so inspiring to see how many projects are started, often by women, without demonstrating that small, diversified farms produce vastly more per unit of land. They're actually more efficient and provide more jobs. And very often the food will cost only slightly more than in the supermarket. However, we want people to know that the food in the supermarket is only cheaper because our taxes subsidize it. So we need to also change. We need to demand that our taxes should not be supporting monocultural farmers on the other side of the world. So this is a framing, an understanding of looking at global versus local that can be incredibly helpful for uniting us. And unfortunately, many people on the left, people who are often very caring and who do particularly care about justice and equality, but also about the environment, they haven't seen this bigger picture. And they often think of local as sort of right wing and something they want to stay away from. And so it's very sad. You know, we urgently need to wake up about the fact that left and right has become meaningless. You care about the well-being of people. You care about their health. You care about their happiness. You care about greater justice, less inequality, and about the environment. Then please look at this global to local framing, because you'll find a lot of answers, and you'll find that the hope and despair, the hope versus the despair, you will really see that there is a way forward that will help you remove the despair and feel much more hopeful about the future.
True. And I also truly believe in the mobilization of people and grassroots movements and through the power of education, which is what we are trying to do with this podcast, bringing different people from different backgrounds, indigenous from everywhere, to speak up and to share their cosmovisions and also their knowledge. And you mentioned, well, we face environmental and social crisis, but and you also raised the alarm in the economics of happiness. Your documentary about the crisis we face, environmental crisis, which seemed like it has been like 15 years since you released the documentary.
No,
And still,
it's not quite 15. It was 2011.
yeah, around the 14.
Yes, it's almost 15. Yes.
Yeah. And you also mentioned now in your last answer about women, and this is really important because they have been marginalized and they have been more impacted by climate change. And we live in a masculine society dominated by masculine and with these extractive values. And I also feel that this lack of power from the feminine and the nurturing part is also connected to our distance from nature. How could we help restore the sense of love and connection that seems to absent in modern society through empowering more women?
Well, again, from my work in Ladakh, it was so clear that in that traditional culture that was more intergenerational, and that meant also that 5-year-old boys would carry babies on their bodies. They'd look up to young animals. I realized that the men had more of their feminine caring side, and the women were so respected in their decision making around social cohesion and management, but also with the land and the animal and the men. So the women were more empowered and, if you like, had more masculine energy. And then when I looked at the change that was coming in because of the global economy, it really was bringing in for everybody a juvenile male culture extreme. I don't know that patriarchal is right. I used to call it a teenage boy culture because teenage boys who loved, guns that go bang and fast motorcycles and fast cars, a very juvenile male culture that doesn't suit older men either. So the whole culture was moving in a direction that didn't suit babies, didn't suit mothers or grandmothers or grandfathers. So the majority of society was being marginalized. Last year, I ran a program I called Feminine Futures. We had it at a college called Schumacher College in England, but we also did an online series with 5 of my women colleagues, 5 or 6 from around the world, from Brazil, from Sweden, and from different fields, a neuroscientist, a climate expert, and so on. And the whole message really was that both men and women need to reclaim their feminine. So women have also been pushed into this very competitive, superficial teenage boy culture. And for both men and women, reclaiming the feminine is the way forward. And that, I think, can also help to avoid the polarization between men and women. And one of the ways that this is happening, because most of these things are happening quite naturally. I wouldn't be so activist if I didn't worry about the new tools for this blind, inhuman system. And the AI, building on the algorithms are going to make it even more inhuman, even more speedy and large scale, amassing wealth and making it virtually impossible for us to have a voice in these dominant systems. If it weren't for that, I wouldn't worry at all because I just see everywhere in the world where people have been driven away from community, away from the land, they start developing a hunger for reconnection, to others and reconnect to the land. So one of the things that's emerging, particularly in the industrialized world, but all around the world, is that people are starting to develop circles of listening. Very often, men's circles, women's circles, very often also mixed, and maybe mother and son circles, mother and daughter. But it's all about a deeper listening, a deeper, vulnerable connection. It's about proving that we can be loved, we can belong without being perfect. The speed, the separation has accentuated the superficial. So it's felt like unless you're beautiful, unless you have a beautiful car, unless you have a PhD, all these externals become important. When people know each other well, it really doesn't matter what car you drive or what PhD you've got. It matters whether you're kind, whether you have a sense of humor, whether you're intelligent, whether you listen, whether you care. So that also in Ladakh, I love that one of their sayings was tiger stripes are on the outside, but human stripes are on the inside, meaning that who you are, those characteristics are inner one. And those we discover as we become closer and slower and more listening. And this is emerging around the world wonderfully with wonderful effects. But what we're trying to do in local futures is to also link that to more practical, grounded change, like starting farmers markets, like also having this big picture activism include more than just listening. Another aspect that I love as part of this is actually singing again, because I witnessed again in Ladakh that traditionally basically everybody sang together and young and old, and then suddenly modernity silences everybody. Now you only listen to the really great singer, the big stars, who sing in a different language here. And to see how even I grew up thinking, oh, no, I can't sing. I only started doing it when I was 60, and I realized it's one of the most joyous and spiritually awakening activities when we sing together, not
Mhm.
on a stage showing off and others listening, but actually the singing, the chanting together, which again, most of us did through our entire evolution.
Mhm.
And so there's so much in the ancient, which is what I say
Yes,
in my ancient futures also. There's so much that we can learn, but I guess I'm slightly frustrated that I feel too many people get hooked on just one aspect and that we need to be more holistic,
mhm.
more holistic, more grounded, more practical, and in a way more political, but not party political. It's about building up enough of a civic society movement for a major political transformation, which has to be economic, because that's where the real power is in the global economy.
True. And I really resonate what you said because I 1 year ago I left my corporate job, and I
Yes.
also singing because I
Oh,
really yeah, I really love to sing, and I start singing again, and it helped me a lot, as you mentioned.
yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. And
Is it?
what do you do now besides singing?
Well, I do research at the university.
Uh-huh.
I have this podcast. I also have I do some consultancy work with specific organizations, trying to help them connect with different, let's say, I don't like the word stakeholders, but that's the way they
Yeah.
use it.
Yeah.
I don't like it, but to connect with different people because communicating sustainability is really difficult. That it is context based, and we need to understand specific reality so we can reach people and make
Yeah.
them understand. And besides that, we also have a program, an educational program in Colombia for kids aged 6 to 12, where
Uh-huh.
we try to make them understand the challenge we face them with nature and also get them inspired by different solutions, especially local solutions, like
Uh-huh.
knowledge. And so local future is really interesting also for us to follow.
Also, I try to explain to people that we can't all leave our corporate jobs, because I
That's
mean,
true.
we're so dependent on that. And I'm trying to urge people to maybe work, maybe a day less or something and liberate themselves mentally, but to just step out and, create an eco village or something is very risky. So I almost prefer that people keep a foot in the dominant system
Mm,
while they so try to build a different life for themselves. But the main thing is that education that could help more people and to get more funding also into creating the alternatives. There's a huge need for funding for the educational side and then also for real models that demonstrate key aspects, particularly around food and farming. It's the emergency of the destruction of farmers is really, we're talking about literally billions of people in the less so-called developed world being pushed off the land and into cities where there are no jobs. And then they try to come to the West where they're now treated with hatred and anger. And it's the destabilization of societies at both sides. And in virtually in every country now, there is job insecurity. So
true.
again, it's back to the economy.
Yeah, it goes back to the economy.
Yeah.
And this has been a really interesting conversation. I would love to continue, but I have one more question regarding your message has always been one of hope. And what would you say to those feeling overwhelmed by the scale of the global issues? What would you say to them, and how can the everyday people start supporting localization in their own communities
Yeah.
and have?
Well, we love in local futures to leave people with 5 words, and the
Okay.
first was reconnect. The
Uh-huh.
second one is rethink, then resist, renew, and rejoice.
Uh-huh.
And the reconnect as the first word is about trying to change the I to a we. And so if anyone is listening and they want to do something, I would urge them to have the first step be find if they could find a friend or a colleague or someone they know who might want to go on a journey of rethinking with them and who might want to follow what we have to say. Is there's a way forward that right now for you could be healing and restorative, and what we're providing is a systemic view that will help you in a more strategic and systemic way to do something about climate change, to do something about the loss of biodiversity, to do something about its rise in inequality. We're providing systemic path, and it starts with this reconnection so that you're not thinking alone, but as part of a group. And that can sometimes be a little bit difficult to get going. But what we urge people to do, even if the group is only 2, 3 people, but up to maybe 20, you want it to be human scale, you want to have one conversation, that to do that over a good meal together, to do that maybe combined with walking in nature together, to do it combined with developing the deep listening and sharing so that you hear and you know that people are not perfect. They might have an eating disorder. They may have a child who's problematic, whatever it is that they can share and feel cared for and feel that they belong. That's already incredibly healing. There's also that when they start thinking as a we, the issues that they can start tackling can become a little bit more systemic. But so the reconnect as the first word, the first reconnection is with other people. I have a lot of friends, including many Indigenous friends, who are now emphasizing the reconnection to nature. It's absolutely vital. But my experience in Indigenous culture is that the reconnection to other humans is even more fundamental. When I look at the epidemic of depression around the world, and it is an epidemic, it's mainly to do with feeling lonely and cut off and feeling like you don't belong. So reconnecting with others and combining that with reconnecting to nature. And I love that, in this very fast paced world where the biggest problem in some ways is that we don't have time. Once we've changed things to a we, which can, like I say, can be a little bit difficult. But one way you can start that is maybe show one of our films at some kind of gathering or community center and see if there's some people who want to continue the discussion. Because once you create a bit of a group, you're actually going to be saving time. You could actually share the time it takes to watch one of those films or to read an article, to find a place where you could go together as a group to do your own vision quest. You don't have to spend thousands of dollars to have it organized. Someone can find a place, a wilderness place, organize for you to camp, help your children simply to just move beyond playing football, to feel themselves part of the trees or the sky, take a slightly more spiritual, contemplative attitude. And you started creating a type of healing through connection to nature. Now, then the very important part of this also is the ongoing rethinking. So the rethinking is you've got to actually, once you look at our materials, you realize that you've been sold on ideas about progress, about everything from schooling to the idea children should play with children of their own age. That's all absolute rubbish. In our whole indigenous history, children never played together in groups of 5 years old, completely natural. And it creates competition, it's a collaboration. So there's a lot of rethinking that we help on the journey of personal healing, but also not to support typical school projects, and to also be aware of how important this human reconnection is. And then the resistance is the willingness to say no, the willingness to look at what we don't want. And that has been co-opted by big business into the idea that if you think about bad things, you give it power. No, it's precisely because we've not been informed about how the system works. We've not had almost any information about it, and we don't talk about it, that it's got so much power. And it's only power that we give to it. It wouldn't have any of that power without our support. And that's really true once we understand how it works. So resistance means a clear, united no, and very importantly, renewal is once we understand this global local dichotomy, once we understand how important it is to rebuild the local fabric, and we start opening our eyes, we'll see there's so much happening that is so positive. And almost all of it, well, I would say 75% is started by women. And it's human scale, it's small, and so it's often not taken seriously, even by activists. But once we wake up, we realize that actually small is beautiful. There's all kinds of evidence as to why we need to decentralize and we need human scale. Every single indigenous culture was human scale. And so we need to really take some of the lessons from indigenous culture, the structural lesson. I get frustrated because there's often a focus just on certain rituals, and those rituals did not actually apply in many other cultures. They're often quite male. It's again a patriarchal thing. In most cultures, women did not do vision quests on their own, out fasting completely on their own. Like in the cultures I work, women say, I've never in my life slept alone. They tell night to come together. They're out in nature in the daytime. But so, so it's, understanding the human scale, understanding the intergenerational side of things. But really importantly, many of the new projects that are being born, they may not look so significant, but once you see them happening everywhere and you realize how they remove the commercialization, the inhumanity of many things. Like recently, I was able to participate in some community funerals that were so beautiful. And they were completely different from the commercial funeral services that are inhuman, commercialized, very expensive, and they don't become a joyous community celebration. So all of these things are actually part of the renewal, of the localization, of the rebuilding of the fabric. And very, very importantly, around local food and other local economy stuff, you're systemically reducing the plastic, the chemical, the transport. You're, providing healthy food, which is the best medicine, etc., etc. So you have reconnect, rethink, resist, renew, and the final word is rejoice. Is reminding ourselves every day, maybe every moment really, to take and appreciate the magic of life. It can even start with our own body, with understanding the remarkable, amazing mystery of how our bodies work, the importance of the breath, then looking out the window and seeing how every blade of grass is unique and different from every other blade, the amazing miracle of life. And this path of localization or economics of happiness is a return home to life, a return home to the feminine, a return home to the fundaments of the ancient. And that's why I call it, ancient futures, local futures, feminine futures. And it's the economics of happiness.
Thank you so much for your time, for your wise words. It's an honor to speaking with you.
Thank you very much.